Welcome to the Taonga Files, the podcast that reconnects whakapapa, mātauranga, and the journeys of Taonga Māori. Ko Migoto Eria Rowell.
Ko Amber Aranui tēnei. Through research, Taonga speak, revealing where they've travelled, who they've touched, and what they carry.
So let's step beyond the register as we uncover stories that shape who we are.
These stories were never lost. They were just waiting to be found.
Kia ora tātou and welcome to the Taonga Files. We're here to share with you today what this podcast is about, who we are and what to expect. The Taonga Files is brought to you from Aotearoa, New Zealand by three of us wāhine, Amber, Migoto and Monica. First and foremost, let's introduce ourselves. Tēnā koe Amber.
Tēnā koutou. Kia ora koutou, ko Amber Aranui ahau. He uri ahau no Ngāti Kahungunu, Ngāti Tūwharetoa, Ngāti Tamakōpere. I grew up in Te Whanganui Ātara, Wellington, a girl from the Hutt Valley, Nainai to be specific. My upbringing was a mix of my ties between Te Ao Māori and my quote Kiwi heritage. My whakapapa spans Aotearoa, as well as Wales, Ireland, and a smattering of European cultures. And I think really this mix has made me quite aware of the connections between people and place, the fractures and impacts of history with things like colonisation, and the importance of understanding where things and people come from, both on a physical and philosophical level. And I feel in many ways, like many people out there, that I walk between two worlds, the world of Te Ao Māori and the world of Te Ao Pākehā. So it's given me a real, I guess you could say bicultural if you want to, but a kind of dual view of the way that things work here in Aotearoa. I am, as of the recording of this podcast, a curator in the Mātauranga Māori team at the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa, New Zealand's national museum. And most of my career has really been in museums, but I have about 20 years experience in the heritage sector. My pathway, I guess, into this type of work really started with archaeology. I was fascinated by the traces that had been left behind by our ancestors, and it enabled me to better understand who I am and where I'm from. And I loved the research side of things. So I did a master's in archaeology and really enjoyed the experiences and the people that I met along the way. And then archaeology, I think, really opened the doors to museums for me. And in museums, I found what I consider to be the human side of research, and that was repatriation. So as a repatriation researcher, I spent over a decade locating Māori and Moriori ancestors that had been held in overseas institutions, so museums, universities and medical institutions. And this work for me really involved what I consider to be detective work. My role included tracing how tupuna were taken and understanding the context and the histories behind their removal, and then also working out where they belonged and who they should be returned to. So each of my projects or tupuna that I sort of focused on, for me, it wasn't just a matter of gathering data. For me, it was about reconnection. It was the fact that I had a responsibility in this mahi, and it was a step towards bringing tupuna home to their people and their whenua. And so after spending a number of years in that type of mahi, I changed careers about 5 or so years ago and became a curator, where I've had a growing passion, I think, for uncovering the stories that our taonga hold. And that's how we got to where we are today. What about you, Migoto?
Kia ora Juan. That was pretty in-depth and comprehensive. I'm going to have to follow that one. Tēnā tātou ko Migoto Eria taku ingoa. I se tau tauku māma no Ngāti Pāhaiwera, Ngāti Ruapani, me Ngāti Huia, taku pāpā, tangata hapani aia. So my mum is Pāhaiwera, Ngāti Ruapani, and Ngāti Huia. My dad is Japanese from Itami, Hyogo in Japan. A little bit like Amber, bit of a dual, heritage. Many of you guys might know that I've been on a bit of a journey in the last 2.5, 3 years in terms of my whakapapa on my papa's side. And I sort of had this thing where, is this what it's like for we Māori studying to, find out more about whakapapa and identity. So I've got a sort of a newfound appreciation, I guess. Not that I've never appreciated it, but because it's a new part of my journey in my life, it's all very new, and finding out more about yourself has its challenges, but also it's very exciting. So I grew up in the biggest town in the universe called Aranui in Napier in Hawke's Bay. I was raised there in a Māori community, graduate of Te Kohanga Reo in Waioheke, and then I graduated to, at the time, what was called Rumarumaki, which you will better understand as kura kaupapa these days. So at the time, Te Kura Reorua o Maraenui was piloting their first immersion program, and I was one of those guinea pigs. So didn't do any harm for me. Here I am, and I firmly believe that the taonga of the reo is what's enabled and supported me throughout my whole career, and it continues to do so. So my background is I used to be a school teacher, and I was a school teacher after I left university. Discovered that's not really what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So spent about 5 years doing that, both in schools, tertiary, and offices. And then I became an editor and a writer of Māori Medium Publishing, and then started my curatorial journey. So curation and working in museums wasn't really something that I was really dreaming about when I was young. It was a place that I had ended up being in. And that's because after having my son, I really wanted to move home. You can't really move home without having a mahi, So there was a job going at the museum as a Māori curator, and they never had one before. And I believed I could do all the things that they said in the job description. So I applied, and it took me over a year to get their job. But also they'd given me a chance to find out what that was like, and took a chance on someone like me. So which I really appreciate. So I was the first Māori curator at MTG Hawke's Bay. Then I moved on to Otago Museum as their first Māori curator. And now I'm back in Wellington, which is where I had my son, where I got married to my husband as well. And here at Te Papa Tongarewa, managing the Māori curatorial team as the head of Mātauranga Māori. Other than the reo, something that's been a real driver in all the mahi that I do is wanting to make a real difference for our whānau hapu and iwi. And I guess it goes back to that kōrero about identity that I mentioned earlier, and actually Amber touched on it as well, about finding out more about yourself and finding out more about your whakapapa, your whenua, your tupuna, and taonga is definitely at the centre of all of that. Taonga is one of those things. I te reo Māori, ko te taonga, te whakatinanatanga, o te aroha o ngā mātua tupuna, koinei ngā kura waihotanga. These are the things that they have, the remnants and the learnings that they have left behind for us to benefit us generations later. So that's sort of where I've got to in terms of I runga I taku huarahi. But it is a real privilege being able to share this kōrero and this kaupapa, this exciting kaupapa with everybody here. So tēnā rau atu tātou katoa. I'd like to invite Monica to introduce yourself. Tēnā koe, Monica.
Kia ora, ko Monica Tromp ahau. I'm the only one that was not born here. I was born in Denver, Colorado. You can probably tell from my accent. But I have not spent a lot of time in the US. I often introduce myself as a European mutt. That's where most of my ancestry is from. A lot of Irish, Scottish, Norwegian, Northwestern Europe. But early in my childhood, my family moved to Zimbabwe, which is where I grew up, and moved around a little bit inside of Zimbabwe, and also went back to America. So I have lived in many different places and cultures, and similar to these guys, trying to find your place in the world and where you fit in with it and how you interact with people. And I did spend some time when I left high school living in America, and had a really big focus on music and audio engineering until I decided to go to uni in my late 20s. And I ended up strangely specializing in archaeological science and Pacific archaeology, which was definitely not something I had ever thought I would do when I was younger. I had always thought I would be in music, and I had initially gone to uni to do electrical engineering, but somehow ended up in archaeology, which is probably a lot to do with how I was raised and being in different cultures and stuff, always having an interest in different points of view and different ways of thinking. And this eventually brought me to Aotearoa in 2013, and I completed my PhD in bioarchaeology. And I've only left once since I got here to do a short postdoc in Germany under much duress. And I've now been working as a researcher at the University of Otago in the archaeology program for several years. And my focus, I've kind of had to make it for myself, has become, I really wanted my work to be meaningful and more accessible. And so that's also part of this podcast, is trying to make archaeological science and things like that more accessible to the communities we work with and just people in general. And we've been working on some pretty exciting stuff. Amber and I will talk a lot more about one of these projects. It'll be the focus of season 2 of the podcast. But why are we even doing this podcast? What is the Taonga Files?
Yeah, thanks, Monica. It's I guess now you've got a little bit of an insight on who we are and our backgrounds, and you'll be able to tell that we actually all come from very different perspectives. So we each bring something different to the podcast, and I think that's what makes us unique and interesting, I think. So, Monica, like you said, what is the Taonga Files? For me, this podcast is a platform to share the stories of Taonga in a way that's accessible to everybody. It's going to be interesting, fun, and at times it's going to be emotional. And if you know me, you know that I like to cry. So no doubt I will be doing that on at least a few of the episodes that we do in the future. But I think our episodes, they're going to be honest dialogues that are shaped by our own views and our own experiences. And they also will create a space for others to share theirs, whether it be from Te Ao Māori or from across the GLAM and heritage sectors.
Amber, you should tell people what GLAM stands for, because most people aren't going to know that one, including myself.
Very true. Very true. Okay, so GLAM stands for galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. So it's a whole sort of heritage sector and sort of archaeology kind of is a bit of a side. So yeah, so this podcast, I don't think, it's not about the dusty archives and boring catalogue numbers. We want to explore Taonga Māori through provenance research, which is a type of research that is anything but boring. It's exciting, it's meaningful, and it's deeply human. So by tracing the journeys of Taonga, this podcast reconnects today's communities with the voices of the past. It's about restoring that connection, reclaiming history, returning mana, and strengthening the bonds between Taonga and the people who hold the relationships with them. Yeah, well, so what about you, Migoto? What is this podcast for you?
I believe it's just offering a platform to share conversation and for Taonga as inspiration. The Taonga Files is a way to be able to engage and unpack kōrero pertaining to the mahi around Taonga research, why it's important and how impactful and inspirational this mahi can be. It's also a useful way to be able to demystify and give explanation to some research and museum processes that people may be interested in hearing about, and we'll be able to share interesting and inspirational stories of some Taonga specifically, relevant projects, repatriation, kaupapa as well. And I believe that the Taonga Files is being able to bring light to these sorts of kōrero through these interviews, and just something I wanted to add in terms of that inspiration. I think I've said about 5 times just in this short period of time, is bringing light to these sorts of kōrero so people feel safe about having these sorts of kōrero. Quite often these kōrero aren't being had as much as they should be. That doesn't mean that some of this kōrero is actually challenging. There might be things that you may not want to know, but there are definitely things that are deeply fulfilling as well. Pēhā koe, Monica, what about you?
I think that the podcast is a good way to do some storytelling in wānanga to help make really complex and difficult things, like you're just saying, more accessible and interesting. And also doing it with colleagues and friends who are in a similar but different path to you can be really powerful and also make the difficult things easier to talk about. And I think our goal with the Taonga Files is to tell interesting stories, with Taonga being the focal point, and to help us all learn more about our past so that we can create a better future for Aotearoa and from all the different perspectives that we come from and the people we'll talk to come from. Exploring all these different points of view and lived experiences alongside different types of research that fall under the provenancing category. And we've talked about that word a few times now in the past few minutes, so maybe we should say what provenancing is, because it's not something that is used in everyday conversation normally, unless you're nerds like us.
Okay, so from a non-academic perspective, I think provenance or provenance research really is a way of understanding the history of Taonga, starting from how they were created or where they were created. And then it follows the history from the time they left their whenua, they left the person who created them, and follows their trails and their journeys through museums, through collectors over the years. So some of these taonga that we are going to be talking about in future episodes, have been in museum collections for hundreds of years. And so the role or purpose of provenance research is to uncover that story. And by uncovering that story, we're then able to reconnect them back with their people, with their whenua, with the people who either directly connect to them, be that the person who created these taonga or the people that used these taonga. And it's really just a way of telling history, and it's something that I am passionate, some might say obsessed with. I guess for me, I've made provenance a speciality. I love a good mystery. I love to uncover the truth. And like Migoto and Monica have said, uncovering the truth isn't always nice. But, I think we need to be honest and throughout this series, I think there's going to be some truth telling that may be difficult for some people to stomach or understand, but I think it needs to be told. So, yeah, provenance, important. I'm a big fan. And we all do it in one way or another that I don't think we all kind of realise. So I hope that's clear enough for everybody.
Okay, so we've heard a little bit about everybody in the team and about what the podcast is. Now, why are we doing this podcast?
Yeah, okay. So I'll start, and I've got a bit of a long spiel, so please cut me off if I'm rambling. So for me, as I sort of talked about provenance research, provenance research itself and the stories that Taonga hold are extremely powerful, but not everybody gets to hear them. Museums, they show objects, but they don't always show the journeys or tell the stories of the journeys or the people connected to them or the impacts that are behind those stories and those taonga. So this podcast really opens up that world in a way that the public has never really had access to before. These stories, they're not abstract. They are about identity, they're about loss, reconnection, and also healing. So every taonga has a journey, and every journey has consequences. Communities, as we know, are still feeling the effects of what happened generations ago. And this mahi is about trying to restore some of those relationships, returning mana and honouring tupuna or ancestors. And that's why I think this podcast matters, because these stories, they deserve to be heard. Most podcasts about museums are made by people talking about the work. But the three of us, we are the ones that actually do the work. We've been in the archives, we've handled those taonga, we've sat with communities, we've traced the journeys and the losses and the returns. We bring lived experience, insider knowledge, and decades of mahi that you just can't Google. And that's what makes the Taonga Files different. It's not theory, it's not commentary, it's the real stories from the people who do this mahi every day. And this mahi is complex. It's slow, it's deeply detailed, and very time-consuming. And most people don't have the time to do the research as in-depth or to share these stories publicly. But we are lucky enough that this is our work. This is what we do for a living. So we're carving out this space because these stories deserve to be told, not hidden in reports or databases. This podcast is our way of making this work visible, accessible, and meaningful for everybody. We're doing this because provenance research changes lives, ours and the communities that we serve. Because taonga aren't just objects, they are living connections. And because these stories, once told, have the power to shift how people understand museums, history, and actually how they understand themselves. So yeah, for me, that is why we're doing this podcast. Migoto?
Awesome, look, I'm just queen of inspired here. And I'm actually going to go quite off script and respond to some of the kōrero that you've just said, which really hits home. And I hope that for the listeners here really heard the kōrero that Amber mentioned about the lived experience. And there's a reality to that. The reality is the hours of mahi, actually sitting in conversations that are really difficult, feeling quite challenged as well, both culturally and personally. Each of us have been through experiences where we have been challenged and actually pushed to our absolute limits. And this is the nature of the mahi that we're talking about. And I think Amber's absolutely right. These are the sorts of kōrero that you don't see in a label, in an exhibition, or in a book even perhaps. And these are the types of kōrero that are really important, particularly for our iwi who are on a journey of self-discovery, figuring out your whakapapa, and it's deeply rooted inside of us. So it's not a journey that's fast. It's not doesn't get resolved overnight, and it can take you on some quite unexpected journeys as well. So there's a very real lived experience to all of that. And I was just sort of thinking about the role of taonga and the reality of all of that stuff. And this is why I think through generations of our iwi seeking inspiration through taonga, I think now, as opposed to years ago, I guess 30 or 40 years ago, it's become, I believe that our iwi have become a little bit more proactive. Our iwi are a little bit more, actually way more qualified now. We've got Māori scientists, Māori researchers who are being acknowledged for the skills that they have, but also aren't waiting for some random museum person to do this mahi for them. They are actually doing it themselves. And I'm hoping that this podcast can also inspire you if you're on that journey to take that step and research your whakapapa, find those answers that you've been looking for. The information that sits within museums is open to everyone. And saying that, kōrero and information that I guess has been repatriated back to iwi, that's something that I guess that reclamation of mana motuhake is also playing out at the moment, which is actually really awesome. But in general, information, records, taonga that museums hold should be accessible to public. It's really about you finding out more and being inquisitive, being curious. And I'm hoping that this podcast can help you be more curious and interested. We can think about those stereotypes of whānau Māori not really coming to museums or museums not being a place for whānau Māori to come. I can say in the time I've been at Te Papa Tongarewa, we have a lot of whānau Māori that come into Te Papa. Maybe it's because we're the National Museum, I'm not too sure. But we do have a steady flow of Māori visitors, which is fantastic. What it's about then is the succession planning of that kōrero to then inspire our younger uri to continue on this kōrero, and so that this kōrero isn't scary, isn't hidden, that's not what we're allowed to talk about. I mean, you may have all heard this from our pakeke and kaumātua. We don't talk about that stuff anymore. We weren't allowed to. And not to say we open up every single thing, but there is something in there, I guess, if you're on that journey, something in there for you that will make a difference for you. So thank you, Amber, for that with my going off script. But it's just really demystifying the role of museums and the mahi that we as kaimahi Māori actually inside the National Museum is a very specific role that we have. Ore, tēnā koe, Amber.
Kia ora.
Monica.
I'm coming at this obviously from a very different perspective because I am an outsider, but I feel extremely privileged to have been part of a lot of this mahi. And my role generally in a lot of these projects and a lot of this detective work is using scientific techniques to help learn more about Taonga. And a lot of those techniques are used in archaeology, but we're trying to take them a little bit outside of that. So they are used in archaeological science, but we're also trying to use them for provenancing research. And these scientific techniques are often shrouded in mystery or not explained in a way for most people to understand. And having an understanding of these techniques and what they can and can't do, how much they cost, and all of those kind of things are often completely unknown to people. So part of this podcast is also a way to make different techniques known. So not only the scientific techniques that I am an expert in, but also all the different kinds of research techniques that are used in provenancing research, whether it's documentary research or looking through the archives or anything like that. So we'll also be talking about those things. We really want to demystify how research works and how these techniques work so that people can be more informed about them. And so that when iwi and other people come into the museum or have a taonga or something from their history that they're interested to learn more about, they can make an informed decision about what they can learn using different techniques and whether or not they actually want to do the technique, and if it's going to be something that's going to damage the taonga or if it's something that we can do that won't damage the taonga, and the different types of knowledge you can get depending on which technique you use. Because there are a lot of techniques that will be very popular and commonly used, but not necessarily something that's going to give you information that's beneficial to you. And so we want to make sure that people can make these informed decisions.
Fabulous. And, so from listening to the three of us and our views about why this podcast, I think it's quite clear why we've created this podcast. It's to share the stories of Taonga, to uncover their journeys that they've taken, and to show how provenance research can help to heal, to reconnect, and to transform. Because when Taonga are re-anchored in their history, their communities are strengthened, the museums themselves can become places of trust, reconciliation, and belonging.
So now we're just getting to our part, we just want to share with our listeners what to expect from the Taonga Files podcast.
So, I think our main episodes, we will dive into a story centred around a taonga, where they come from, how they travelled, and what they mean today. We'll talk to experts, museum staff, and whānau, hapu and iwi. You'll hear stories of discovery, reconnection, and sometimes surprises that can change everything. We have developed a season format, which will have a specific kaupapa. So season 1, which will look at our colonial past and acknowledging our colonial past. And then season 2, as Monica mentioned earlier, we'll look at a project that we're doing called Ika Moana, Ika Whenua. And I have to say this, I'm really excited to talk to everybody more about this project.
And we're also going to be, in between these main episodes, we're going to have some mini episodes to do what I was just talking about earlier, trying to explain and explore the different techniques that are used in different types of research with little mini episodes. People can start to build up a knowledge of how these things are used to do provenancing research.
Awesome. And I guess by coming with us on this journey, you'll hear stories, interviews, and experiences centered around museum taonga and objects, discover taonga that have never been seen by the public, stories that have never been told, and even go into depth into taonga that you thought you knew and the events that surround them. So I think what's interesting is that you'll hear a lot of the behind the scenes stories about our museum work, case studies of taonga and the journeys, as Amber mentioned earlier, conversations about ethics, provenance, repatriation, and museum practice, and of course the interviews with all of our tohunga experts, kaitaki, and also from the community as well. Honest reflections on the challenges and the joys of this mahi, because it's not always doom and gloom and bad. And then a mix, of course, of mystery, history, humour, and heart.
So if you're passionate about these stories as we are, subscribe to the Taonga Files wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media, share your thoughts, and if you have a Taonga story, we'd love to hear from you. We have a presence on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and we also have a Patreon page where you can give feedback and updates. So we'll give updates to you. And we also have an email address, the taongafiles@gmail.com. And we plan to put these out every couple of weeks with a mini episode in between, and we'll see how that goes.
So ngā mihi nui for joining us. Next time, we'll open our first file and we'll step into the stories that have shaped us. Until then,
keep listening.
Keep connecting.
And remember,
Every
Taonga has a story.